big conversation about M&A, IP, and product liability trends impacting medtech. So I really enjoy good M&A talk. Happy to hand this over to Ginger Pigott of Greenberg Traurig.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here. As he said, I'm Ginger Pigott. I'm an attorney with Greenberg Traurig. I'm a shareholder in our Los Angeles office, and my specialty is product liability, primarily for the medical device industry, pharma, and others. And I'm going to be moderating us through this panel today with some fantastic panelists who are going to tell you a little bit more about themselves. First, I'd like to introduce immediately to my left Marlon Housman with Medtronic. Marlon has been with Medtronic for more than 20 years and has a lot of big company experience to share with you. Next to him, we have Casper de Clercq, who's with Norwest Venture Partners. In addition to spending 15 years investing in amazing, interesting companies, he was an entrepreneur, worked with big industry, and has a lot to tell you about his experience and what's going on in the industry now. And furthest to my left is my partner, Roman Fayerberg, who is an IP attorney and will give you some fantastic information about what's going on and how to protect your intellectual property. And before we get started, how many of you are with small to mid-sized medtech companies? Anybody here consider themselves in the medium-sized range? Okay, a couple. Anybody in big med device? Anyone? Okay, well, we got him here. He's on the panel. So I'd also like to mention that I used to perform with an improv company down in Los Angeles, something that I loved to do. It's just a fun fact. And I'd like to provide a couple of additional fun facts before we get started with the serious stuff. And that is, we've got an empty nester right here. So he's looking for some ideas for some hobbies from Marlon. Casper used to do a lot more of his telemark skiing and kiteboarding, but small children mean that has been curtailed for a little while. And my partner Roman is a big cyclist, although in Boston in the winter, that's often inside. Anyway, we're going to get started, and we're going to jump around a little bit. This is the marketing piece about Greenberg Traurig, so you all hire us as your attorneys, so we won't stay there long. Here's some photos of us. Fantastic. Here's our agenda. We're really going to run through, we only have 45 minutes, so we're going to talk a little bit jumping around about best practices at each stage of your development. We think this is really important. IP protection kind of folds right in there, so those two topics are really intertwined along with financing and exits. And then product liability risk mitigation, that's something that most folks in this room aren't really thinking about. And I tend to be the one that can scare you about what happens when you're finally successful. But what you can do in the early stages to really reduce and mitigate those risks, really think about what you're going to be doing. Are we going to have salespeople in the field and so on? So let's start with the first hot topic. And I thought really I would start a little bit with you, Casper, to talk about what kind of trends you're seeing, and in particular, in early stage investments. And I know you had some slides we put in here, if you want me to skip ahead to those. I don't know exactly where they are, but we're going to skip ahead. Which one is your, let's go here.
Oh, that helps. There we go.
We're going to skip ahead. Hold on, skipping, oh wait, here. Is this your, this is your. So
Great.
Let's start with you a little bit, Casper, if you don't
Great.
mind telling us a little bit about, what you're seeing at early stage, what you're seeing in terms of financing in particular.
So just a quick introduction. Norwest has been around for 55, close to 60 years now. It's one of the earlier companies. It was actually started in Minneapolis under Norwest Bank, which, little known fact, Norwest actually acquired Wells Fargo but kept the Wells Fargo name. So in fact, we invest significantly for Wells Fargo.
And I did forget to remind you to do your introduction. So please give a little more about your background too. I apologize.
Sure, no worries. So I'm a general partner at Norwest. I've been there for the last 10 years. I was at a company called US Venture Partners before that, and then serial entrepreneur for 20 years before that, starting in consulting, and then started several companies, sold two, and learned the hard lesson with a number 3. Or actually, it was number 1. So we were investors in probably most recently Silk Road, which is a public company, so I can't comment on that. But iRhythm also, which went public a couple years ago. Intersect D&T, which I think is now 3 years ago. I wish we'd have been investors in Livongo, but we were actually investors in a competitor called Telcare, and over a drink I can tell you why we didn't succeed and they did. Maybe just jump forward one slide if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
This is something that people don't see very often. It comes from Cambridge Associates. Cambridge Associates is sort of the data source, if you will, for investors to look at various classes of venture funds and private equity funds. And what's quite interesting here, so it's a little hard to read, but if you look at, this is since the year of investment, all companies that were invested in that particular year, what was the internal rate of return on those investments? So the first thing that would probably draw your attention is if you look at biotech, for the last, since 2009, so for the last 10 years, if you look at some of those early companies, has been generating 50% IRRs. Wouldn't we all be so lucky? That's large an extent, it's largely due to the fact that companies have gone public. They're, from an venture's perspective, hard to get out of because those public companies are basically supported by their venture investors. But if you compare that to, say, healthcare medical devices, what you see is just a really long dry period there from 2000 to 2009. And then it starts to pick up a little bit with respect to the companies that are generating return. And I like to say sometimes I'm one of the taller midgets in the being on the medical device side on the venture business, because it was just a very, very hard period with the FDA. Until recently, honestly, until probably 2-3 years ago when the FDA enabled fast track and orphan drug designation, for example. So that's that's definitely improved outcomes. I'd say the other big thing that's been happening is consolidation, just like we saw in pharmaceuticals, the consolidation of the medical device industry. I'm just thinking back to U.S. Surgical going to Covidien going to Medtronic.
I was going to ask whether Marlon, you've seen something similar from your side, or how what Casper is talking about relates to what you've seen in terms of trends, and what you kind of are. I know you're more in the what keeps you up at night category of acquisitions. But.
So I think I've seen that as well. I mean, certainly at Medtronic, we had a huge acquisition spree in the mid to late 90s. And then it went pretty quiet. But then we had a couple of years ago, or a few years ago now, we had a pretty large acquisition with Covidien, a big strategic acquisition. And I think, the direction we're heading now, and as other companies are as well, I think we're those large strategic, game-changing acquisitions, they're really not around as much. And they're very difficult and very high risk. So I think now the attention is really being made to the smaller, how can we, add some revenue here and there, to the individual businesses by acquiring smaller companies' products, et cetera. And money's tight, budgets are tight. So R&D is the budgets are shrinking. There's a lot more pressure. So as a result, we do look elsewhere, for developmental technologies. So I think, at least in my experience, that's what we're seeing.
And Marlon, just give us the 30-second introduction about your background and kind of where you come from.
So I started with a company called Arterial Vascular Engineering. It was a small startup in Santa Rosa, California. Started there about 22 years ago. And about 6 months after I joined, we got acquired by Medtronic. Arterial Vascular Engineering was making angioplasty products. We made some balloon catheters, but our real big ticket item was a new and innovative stent that was much more deliverable as a coronary stent, way more deliverable than anything else on the market. And this little company basically took on the J&Js, the Boston Scientifics, the Medtronics, the Guidance, and really just shot up out of nowhere. And this was a really small company. When I joined the company, it was just a little over 800 people. In a year and a half, we were 3,200 people. And we grew, I think we were about $900 million. Went from about 200 or 300 million to 900 in a really short period of time. Of course, those are kind of growth rates you can't maintain year over year. So, it's got this downside as well.
And have you seen that cyclical trend recur again in terms of your new position at Medtronic or Casper and in sort of what you guys are looking at with the way that companies are acquired or smaller players coming in with something really innovative and either being, licensing that technology or being acquired and how they're going through that process?
Well, I think we were always trying to figure out what Medtronic was, what Omar wanted to buy next. But and I think the mandate for a long time was it had to be a profitable company or cash flow positive. So we kind of we thought, well, we're just not going to be in the running for those kinds of acquisitions.
Yeah, that was a very hard and fast rule. That preceded Omar. That was, the Bill George, Art Collins mandate that, all acquisitions had to be accretive immediately. Yeah. Well, that was great when our valuation was through the roof, but we eventually came back to earth. And so, when we have, the more realistic earnings ratios, it's a little tougher to make these acquisitions accretive from the start. So we have a little more of a runway to get to profitability with these acquisitions, and certainly that is a very, very large profitability is a very large objective.
And Casper, what would you? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say the other thing that I guess we're discussing thematically is I think pharmaceuticals, as you probably know, is all of R&D is effectively outsourced now. I think for pharmaceutical companies, they're incredible distribution machines, and I think that's probably where medtech is going increasingly. It's probably less innovation internally, as you're just saying, because of just budget constraints. So why not go outside? And frankly, unlike a lot of technology-driven markets, I think a lot of med devices has sort of happened, right? You're not going to start a cardiovascular stent company at this stage, or balloon angioplasty company that it's all around TAVR, and can you come up with a new, even there, it's very difficult to come up with a new valve. So it's about access, closure, maybe embolic protection devices. We've seen a lot of those. So a little bit smaller areas that came out of a technology that kind of spurred a lot of change.
And do you have any kind of, best advice or top 3 tips for, early stage companies looking for financing, what it is that they can do to make themselves more attractive? And Roman, maybe you can jump in here too in terms of IP protection at some point, but Casper, what would you say to that?
Well, we tend to be a little bit later stage investors, so we are happy to write a $25, $50, $60 million check. And that tends to be fairly rare in terms of the companies that we see. But I'd say the strategy bifurcates, right? That you either, Duke Rolene, who's been quite successful, I just saw him on stage a couple of weeks ago, and his whole strategy is to go talk to the acquirers first. Go talk to people in business development and figure out what it is they want to buy. And he specifically goes off and designs something that has IP that he can do very efficiently and sell. The companies that we tend to see are those that want to go public or certainly are commercializing. And I think the lesson I've learned is don't commercialize in Europe because you're not going to make money. The second thing is that if you're going to commercialize in the US, it's probably going to take you 4 years and somewhere between $50 and $100 million to really get to a place where Medtronic would even begin to consider you, I think. So because it's so expensive, you really have to have an idea that's transformative. So for example, the Shockwave, started by a friend of mine, which was lithotripsy effectively for calcified vessels in the heart and the legs. That was a very significant idea. We said no, we didn't think it was going to get acquired, and it ultimately had to go public. And they're just getting started on revenues now.
And I've turned to your hot device areas of investment. Just thought it might be a good segue, but also want to talk about kind of where you see the trends going, or, obviously this is some historic and early 2019 data about where investment is putting its dollars, basically.
So I was actually surprised to see this. Mark, you probably see the same. I mean, I don't know what you're seeing with respect to what the larger companies are doing. I was surprised that orthopedic is on track to do 20 device deals or device investments this year. I suspect that a lot of these, I'm not all familiar with exactly which ones those are. There's a lot of built to sell technology here. So it could be new fusion devices, could be new screws, rods and screws. K2M was acquired by Stryker, I think it was last year, for I think 1.1 billion. And that started out as basically a rod and screw system. So that's going on there. Cardiovascular, I think, is largely around valve technologies. I think the areas that are growing significantly are non-invasive monitoring and imaging. We've probably seen, gosh, I don't even know how many, probably half a dozen AI companies that are going after image analysis and automated analysis. So things that the typical radiologist would be looking for, say small nodules in breast cancer. There are lots and lots of companies like that. And then on the non-invasive monitoring side, that's imaging and non-invasive. There's a lot of, these days, fusion, for example, of CT and PET scans, or MRIs and PET scans, and then actually pairing that with robotic surgery. So, for example, in neurosurgery. So that's a pretty interesting area. Thanks for pushing me along.
Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize here. People are welcome to jump in.
Yeah.
So just on the robotics theme, Think is just got funded $100 million for commercialization, and then Histosonics is an ultrasound machine, basically robotic ultrasound. But Think is both hip and knee resurfacing, completely robotic. So kind of a subsequent follower to Mazor or Mazor, I don't know how you pronounce it. We looked at PQ bypass, for example, which is that's more on the venous side. So vascular, there are a couple companies in that area. I'm trying to think of which ones other to bring up. Kayla Health was very interesting. We looked at the company as well. This is for essential tremor, and it turns out that you can stimulate the wrist, and afferent and efferent nerves come back to prevent the tremor. It's fascinating. But that's really going to be a consumer product, so not really going through traditional healthcare. Candid is an aligned technologies. So remember the thin see-through braces that you can wear. So Candid is chasing that because the IP, I think, is expired. So I'm sure you all can inform us on that. You want to say anything about ablative, or maybe not? That's, there's a tremendous amount of funding still available with respect to early stage companies like that. A lot of this still comes from angels. I just met with a company in Los Angeles. An angel investor had put in $50 million to date. So I don't have any friends like that, but there is a lot of money available. There's 10X, there's Silicon Valley Angels here in the Bay Area. And you can easily get sort of $1 to $3 million from smaller investors.
And where do you need to be in order to capture your eye?
To capture my eye, unfortunately, you need to be. We typically look at only at cleared devices. Again, just having been burned by the FDA previously, right, or a 510K. So we want to see clinical data, ideally.
And obviously, IP protection is critical to that. I'm going to go back up here for a second to talk about, not the agenda, too far. We did have this on here about there are some financing opportunities through academia, grants and other things. I think that was maybe more common over the last couple of years, but we do hear of people who are successfully raising money that way at early stages. And here, I think, Marlon, you wanted to talk a little bit about the things that you think about in terms of looking at a company holistically and what might make you interested as Medtronic, basically?
Yeah, and before I get to that, I did want to make a comment of working with academic institutions, which obviously have some of the best resources and the brightest minds, and they're a great partner. But they've also realized how great they are and what kind of resources they have. So I think you need to be careful. You might end up doing a deal with the devil, because I do know, I've heard experiences of companies doing deals with academia and finding out that basically all of the IP and the resources that they've put in this collaboration with the academic institution by contract ends up being owned by the institution. So be careful. Make sure you get, and I don't know if you've got a comment on that.
I want to echo you. I mean, obviously, academia is a great source of IP, right? They come up with the inventions, and you said when you invest into a company, you want to make sure you have a position that's protectable position that has IP around it, so you get in proprietary technology, and it's a good way to get the IP fast, to get at least the foundational IP fast and some data behind it. But yeah, you have to be careful with the licensing agreements, and that's usually comes up during the due diligence, who owns what part of the IP, and how important is the foundational IP, and whether all the rights are, because a lot of times what we're also seeing in due diligence with academia, that they, a lot of different institutions work together. So you have to make sure that, when you get in a license from University A, that you're also accounting for the rights of any other co-inventors, and it's definitely something we look at during due diligence.
And Roman, just give the 1 minute version of your background as well, because I neglected to do that.
I'm a patent attorney with Greenberg Traurig. I've been in the medical device industry for also almost 20 years now. Started my career as a R&D engineer at Boston Scientific, and then at CR Bard for law school. And so now I've been a practicing attorney for a little bit over a decade. And still, most of my clients are on the medical device side. The practice kind of split between, I work with companies to help them build their portfolios, manage their patent portfolios, and also work with a number of investors on the due diligence side.
Just want to make sure you know who's telling you what. I think it's on.
Just to add one thing, certainly when we invest, we'll probably spend $50,000 on IP, particularly if it's more complex. And then I know with respect to Stanford, for example, the professor has to be very, very careful, and I'm sure it goes to you when you acquire, that if any work is done on the campus, it becomes a property, or certainly there's a toehold there from the academic institution.
So Marlon, you want to continue with?
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about the sexy stuff but compliance. And the reason being is because I think this is, from my experience, is one of the areas that's most overlooked by smaller companies looking to set themselves up for an acquisition. So the things we look at when we do diligence on a company from a compliance perspective, is what kind of liability are we potentially getting ourselves into? That does affect our valuation. I've been in many talks with smaller companies who believe that some of these things don't really apply to them. They're flying under the radar. Nobody ever, comes after companies that small, which is all true. But when you get acquired by a larger company, whether it be Medtronic or Boston or Bard or whomever, we've got the big targets on our back. And one of the things that I need to point out is that the Department of Justice had come out with some guidelines on how to evaluate a compliance program. And I'm not talking about the compliance programs of the acquisition target, but of the larger companies like Medtronic. And one of the 11 criteria is the diligence process for M&A. So they will look at our diligence. Did we discover the misconduct that should have been stopped or corrected? And if we didn't discover it in diligence and we didn't correct it immediately, we are putting our company at risk with liability. And there's something known as the Park Doctrine. And what the Park Doctrine says is that RCOs, or responsible corporate officers, can be personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, incarceration for criminal liability, and exclusion from the medical payer programs. So what the Park Doctrine basically says is, if you're a responsible corporate officer, or if you are an officer in a company where you're in a position that you're responsible to prevent that kind of misconduct, or in a position that you should have been able to find that misconduct and correct it, and you don't do that, you can be held personally responsible. So it goes through, it pierces that corporate veil. So that is something I think as a lawyer, right, that's my main job. I want to do my job, and I really don't want my executives going to jail. I don't want my executives being told that they can't work for a company if they do, that company's products won't get reimbursed by Medicare. These are things that are $100,000 fines. These are things that, keep me up at night.
Sure.
We talked about that earlier. What are the things that keep me up at night during a potential acquisition? And those are the types of things that definitely do. What are the things that we see that the government is really looking at? Obviously, off-label promotion is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I can do a whole session on off-label promotion, so I don't want to bore you guys there. Privacy is getting way more complicated than it used to. We used to only really have to worry about HIPAA in the old days, right? And now we've got, GDPR, which is global data protection, and then there's various state laws like the California Consumer Protection Act. Now we've got to worry about all these different laws in all these different states. One of the themes of this conference is robotics and artificial intelligence. Well, artificial intelligence is nothing without the data, right? So if you guys are working on those types of technologies, you really need to work and put in the effort to make sure you have an adequate data protection program.
Well, not to mention the fact that if you've got cross-border data and your intention in the most positive and wonderful way is to utilize that data from around the world to improve medical outcomes, but you have to be very careful about how that data is being developed, how that data is being brought into the U.S. if it is, and there are lots of other little tricky things to keep in mind. But I know that a lot of people in this room, from having done this conference in the past, are more worried about, can we get from A to B, and not just Series A to B, but really in looking at, does our product work and how do we get more money to develop it? But all of these things, if you're not thinking about them, and in particular the IP and how you're protecting it, then at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because you don't have anything to sell. And I think that's one of the keys to a successful exit, and that's what we talk about and what trends and what new things are happening. And we're not going to spend a lot of time in this section. We have about 17 minutes left of the presentation. So Roman, I don't know if you want to go through some of the keys here in terms of the patent portfolio strategies or new developments, and just let me know if you want me to move the slides ahead.
Sure. We already touched on a few things, and I think, obviously it's very important to have, as I said, protectable position. It has to be, as you develop the device, you have to have some strategy how the device or your technology is going to be protected. Different layers of IP kind of built that protect the technology. You can have IP protecting the platform, or you can have IP protecting the specific devices or even components of devices. The more layers you have, obviously it gives you a better position. But on the other hand, you have to be concerned about what competition is doing. And that's the part of the due diligence, where you do freedom to operate, opinions. You need to make sure you know what the landscape is, because obviously it's going to come up with the during due diligence. Either, as I said, part of my practice is doing due diligence, and we always ask. It's a standard question to ask, because again, you want to get a technology that's protected by patents, but because you get patents on technology doesn't mean you can actually practice it. And then probably we can talk about more, and there is also a risk of business litigation. Even though you can have a good argument that your IP doesn't infringe anybody's patents, there may be reasons, business reasons, and there may be patents that are close, and the arguments can be made that IP. So it's something that you want to know about, especially as you get close to the financing rounds or partnership because this thing's gonna come up in due diligence, and you want to be ready to address them.
Casper's going to ask you before he writes that check. He's going to want to know.
I mean, what do you guys what's your standard patent due diligence? If you want?
We obviously look at freedom to operate and then defensibility. And, there's actually an interesting, we just looked at a company that's in the surgical stapling business. And one of the big worries is, U.S. Surgical was all over that. But it turns out a lot of those patents are beginning to expire. But we'd still be very, very careful. We don't even start unless we think the IP is protectable.
You don't want to go up against Marlon and Covidian on that.
No, absolutely not. And I mentioned this right before the panel, but I have a friend in a company who spent $7 million defending himself against an incumbent who had, call it 80 million in revenues, and it was cheaper for them to just keep suing the company rather than spend the money on marketing. And he had a relatively good position, but they had extended their own patents to read on his, and so they kept dragging him through court in Europe and then in the US. So I think it is really, you can comment much more than I can about how do you get freedom to operate so you don't get stuck in that kind of a situation.
No, I mean, it's difficult because you do a search and you kind of find patents, competitor patents in different categories, right? There are some that are clearly not going to infringe. There are some where there's some risk, and there are some that, from the legal perspective, there's definitely a very low risk of litigation, but you can make an argument. Or with what you're referring to as continuation practice. So once you file a patent application, say you file your first patent application, it goes through the patent office before it gets issued. Once it's allowed, you can file another patent application, and it still claims the original priority, so it's still the original prior art that will apply, but you can change the claims as long as you have support. So if you see a competitor product and if you have a kind of thorough application, you may be in a position where you change the claims just enough to get closer to the competitor product. And it's something, it's very hard to predict, obviously, but that's that usually that's kind of what we get paid for, to be able to assess the risk of that. And now you see, I'm actually working on a freedom, and you see applications that are 100+ pages long, which is, you see that in biotechnology commonly, but you don't see it in medical devices that much because most of them are, it's a simpler technology, but now you see those patent applications that, they'll put everything in, and the reason is so they can just keep filing continuation applications as necessary.
And I think we'll probably spend less time on this slide than it maybe warrants if there are people out there who are interested in the major patent litigation cases. I think we can talk about that briefly.
I'll just give a quick overview. The Supreme Court's been very active in the patent law arena in the last, I would say, 6 years. I'm not going to go through the cases. There were 2 cases from the Supreme Court last year, 2 this year, but I think the main thing is main question is what constitutes patentable subject matter.
Right.
And I think the devices, usually it's the high tech or the kind of the biotechnology where those questions come up. But as we move, as Marlon mentioned, as we start moving more imaging system, AI, the questions what's patentable arises. And that's, so you're not just looking at the prior art, but also you need to make sure that what you're trying to patent, your technology, is patentable subject matter. And that's been a hot topic for a number of years, and there's a number of cases now from the federal circuit that coming up and might be decided by the Supreme Court. So just to provide, because it's a very uncertain area, and hopefully we'll get more guidance.
And do you find that, and this is really for the whole panel, but the fact that there are non-traditional competitors entering the field in the medical device space, some of them are traditionally consumer products that are targeted towards healthcare or, health improvement or technology related, and how that is impacted what you're seeing in the medical device industry, or has that just been expected, basically?
It's expected, but as I said, really the difference is how you write the application and what you claim is And now with the technology, you get a lot of more like wireless technology, technologies that combine your traditional medical device with software, things like that. And that definitely requires different strategy for protection.
There's a lot. We see a lot of wireless or device communication. Devices that communicate or collect data, and that certainly allows differentiation. I'd say not to overemphasize the patents and not to overemphasize the difficulty. What we do tend to look for is, from a defensibility standpoint, it might be a narrow claim, but if the product is going to require a PMA or has accumulated thousands of patients, we tend to think that that's fairly defensible. I don't know how you look at that as well, Marlon.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. And I think there's a lot of room for some real game-changing technologies out there. I mean, just the other day, I think it was on Amazon or something. I saw a little device, for $50, you can put your finger in and get an EKG. I mean, the EKG machines used to, be the size of this table. I mean, with the needles going and the electrodes all over the place. It's insane what's coming out now. And I think, personally, I think it's a great thing. I mean, from Medtronic's perspective, we're bigger, we're a little more slow moving, perhaps. I think we are looking to those technologies, and I'm actually, very excited that we are moving in that area. But it is changing. The game is changing. It's an exciting time. So.
Well, and I think definitely with the advent of these crossover products, where your watch is telling you if your blood sugar's too high or your, heart rate's too high, or, and what those implications are. And you've got companies like Medtronic, traditional medical device companies, expanding into healthcare solutions, right? So areas that sound a little bit more like healthcare than the traditional, here's the bone screw, here's the pacemaker, and so on. And a lot of companies that are innovating are trying to figure out some of the big challenges that we face in healthcare. And that presents challenges not only from financing and IP, but also in my area of product liability and how that product will be treated if and when somebody has a bad outcome. And, we've talked a little bit about financing and exit trends and what we're seeing. And I didn't know whether Marlon or Casper, you had any other additional advice inspired by our conversation relating to, what companies need to be looking for in terms of their end goals. And, obviously that's going to be individual to the company, but anything else you wanted to?
Just going to go back to kind of the consumerization of a lot of med tech. Sure. I was thinking about butterfly effect, for example, which is an ultrasound probe attached to your cell phone. But the new problem you create is, ultrasound is pretty hard to do unless you're a trained echocardiographer. So there are now companies that are working on how do you actually acquire the right image, or providing very simple guidance, as to twist or turn, or, how to direct the probe. So you can imagine a whole sort of series of corollary products and things that spin off from that. I think with respect to just answering, how to prepare yourself. IP is clearly a big part of this.
Right.
And I would say make a decision early as to whether you want to be acquired or go public. What we found is for companies at a later stage, we again had the fortunate situation of where we had a choice between getting acquired, or the company getting acquired, or going public. And we found that in the stock market, the companies were probably 2 to 3 times as valuable as the acquisition offer. But it is a very expensive and lengthy process. And so if you're a founder, unless it's a really massive idea, it's a long road. And I think the path that I've seen to more rapid success has been basically build a company to be acquired and not go for commercialization, but get your device used by, call it a handful of KOLs, and then those typically attract the interest of a strategic buyer. I'm guessing that's what you want.
I think that's right. Obviously, it's a lot easier for us to acquire a company that hasn't gone public. But on the other hand, if you've gone public and you've got a killer technology and a great business setup, that's not going to stop us.
Do
I
you
mean-
guys have preferences for pre-market approved PMA products over 510K clearances? Or, I mean, obviously I do on a product liability case, but that's a totally different scenario.
So,
I mean,
boy,
PMA is more expensive to maintain, obviously.
it's also a bigger barrier to entry. So,
Right.
you get more protection from a PMA device. So certainly for a company the size of Medtronic, and also I think the more lucrative devices are probably PMA devices for the most part. So I don't want to say we have a preference, but I would say we definitely have a need and a desire for PMA devices and a place for them as well as 510K. Again, I wouldn't let that be the determinative factor for us.
I know that some companies do consider pathway to market, where they could get by, they could maybe potentially get by on a 510K. They have the option to, consider the PMA pathway. We look sort of with 2020 hindsight when we're looking at those decisions from a product liability standpoint. That's a little bit different, but it's interesting to me about, what's more valuable when you're coming at it from the front end.
The other advantage, I think, of a PMA and going through the clinical trial process as opposed to a 510K is with a 510K, your indications are going to be limited by the predicate devices. You can't expand, with few exceptions, which actually usually involve doing more clinical studies. But a 510K, you're going to be stuck with the indications of the predicate device. It may not be the indications you want to market to.
Right.
So with a PMA, you get to define your indication to meet your marketing objective. And why is that important? Well, again, the off-label concern. Off-label promotion is a huge potential liability, both for the company and personally now. So those are the things that I think, as a lawyer, I would prefer the PMA.
Well, and sometimes the off-label use is in advance of what you can do from a regulatory standpoint. So we see historically and even today that doctors and healthcare providers are using things in the way that they see best, and oftentimes that is off-label, and that's perfectly fine for them. It's just not perfectly fine for your sales representatives to be out there encouraging and promoting. So it's a little bit of an interesting area of the law, where the First Amendment actually comes in on that, truthful free speech that everyone can have except for the sales rep. So, this was one of our, funny haha slides from how the app on your phone can pretty much do anything. But really, that is, the trend that continues from last year to this year and forward, and I think it only gets more exciting in this industry. And we are basically wrapping up. We've got 2 more minutes. I don't know if anyone in the audience had an important question that they wanted to ask, or I could spend the next 2 minutes scaring you. Preferences? Question?
Will you share your opinion about provisional patent? Is it something to consider, to use? If no, why? And if yes, how?
Yeah, I mean, we actually, most of the cases we start with a provisional patent, especially, it locks in your priority date, early priority date, but then it doesn't count the patent term that's 20 years. The standard patent term is 20 years. The provisional doesn't count towards the patent term. So you have the priority. Let's say if you filed it today, you'd have a priority to 2019, but your term will start in 2020, which is an advantage. The second advantage is, especially for smaller companies, your technology can change. So once you file a non-provisional application, you cannot change that anymore. You can change the claims as long as you have support, and that's why the continuation applications, but you cannot add figures, you cannot add details. And with the smaller kind of earlier stage companies, your technology can change from day to day, and you don't want to wait too long because you want to lock in your priority, but then we want to have that flexibility. One pitfall that we see a lot is, especially in due diligence, is the provisional application. It's not as formal as a utility application. The drawings can be hand-drawn. You don't have to include claims. And what a lot of people do is, I'm going to save money on it. I'm just going to file like my marketing brochure or something like that. That's not a real patent application. And then you think you have a priority, but the priority is only for the subject matter you disclose. So I wouldn't say like provisional application needs to be pretty much as you would file a formal non-provisional application. Again, maybe the figures are not formal, but everything else should be as complete and as detailed as possible.
Casper, Marlon, any final comments before we let these fine folks go? Anything interesting?
The provisional side, I would file as fast and as thoroughly as you can, certainly before you go talk to an investor. We sign NDAs, but even that, you want to be careful.
Sure. And I'll just wrap things up by saying that medical device litigation is here to stay. It's important to think about not only compliance from a perspective of how you're doing business, but looking at ways to reduce, mitigate, or eliminate litigation. And there are lots of ways to do that. I'd be happy to talk to anyone who has any of those kinds of questions. But medical device litigation is a big target. If you have sales representatives in the field, that's a good place. Even if you have a PMA product, 510K, there's lots of documentaries. We talked about this last year. The bleeding edge was a big problem in terms of the way that the public sees the medical device industry, and that reputation used to be much more pristine, and now we're seeing a change. So, look, we really appreciate your attention, and we've enjoyed being here for you. And thank you to my panelists who are fantastic, and I appreciate your time as well. So thank you very much.